Pat's final stream was last Saturday. It was beautiful and emotional. This man who meant so much to us, who we looked up to, who even in his final stream that was dedicated to celebrating his legacy, was so generous and raised over $230,000 for charity. What better way to honor his memory than by dragging his very first FNAF theory through the mud? Nah, I'm kidding. But we are going to look critically at the date that he and other theorists have proposed for when FNAF 1 takes place using facts and logic and spreadsheets. And we're going to examine some completely new evidence I doubt you've ever heard before, and old evidence from angles you've never thought of. Why? Certainly not once again because of evidence in your favorite book the week before. Right, Candi? Right, Candi? Oh boy, not again. I can't help it, I love this book, and it's so full of lore. But don't worry, we're not gonna spend the whole video in the week before. We're gonna examine other riveting sources, like spreadsheets and the Social Security Administration website. Ooh. I'm Candy Bunny, and welcome to the most in-depth guide you'll ever need for when FNAF 1 takes place. Why do we care? I don't know, you clicked on the video, you tell me. Just kidding. It's because FNAF 1 is the original that we all fell in love with. It's the reason why we keep happily giving Scott Cawthon our money and watching more theory videos than is good for any well-adjusted individual. And from the beginning, we've tried to scrutinize when it takes place. And 10 years later, we're still no closer to a consensus on the answer. And at this point, it's grown from a gnawing curiosity to an all-consuming obsession. How can we have sat with this game for a decade and still the only answer we can agree on for when it takes place is, sometime after FNAF 2. 1989, 1992, 93, 94, 2003? Let's rip every piece of evidence we have to shreds and find out which is more likely. Before we begin, an announcement. Easty Beastie in my comment had the genius idea that my followers should be called the Cadets because I got that whole candy routine going on and I'm in love with the idea. So, congratulations Cadets on your official promotion. FNAF 1. FNAF 1 takes place after FNAF 2 and before FNAF 3. FNAF 2 takes place in 1987 because our check is dated, and FNAF 3 takes place in... Yeah, that's much more unclear, but at least FNAF 2 was useful. There are 3 pieces of evidence in FNAF 1 itself to help us deduce the date. Matt Pat, may he enjoys retirement, pointed out all 3 in his first ever FNAF theory. Number 1. Five Nights at Freddy's is a Chuck E. Cheese analog with the pizza and the child's entertainment and the animatronic performers. Chuck E. Cheese was founded in 1997, had its heyday in the late 80s through the 90s, and is still in business today. The newspaper clippings that can appear on the wall give us the impression that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was quite popular before several children went missing, lured away by someone dressed in a company mascot. The newspapers describe them as much-loved animal mascots, and that they're having trouble getting families to come back after the tragedy, which implies to me that many families and children used to love this place. So perhaps this takes place around the heyday of Chuck E. Cheese, late 80s or 90s. Number 2.
If I were forced to sing those same stupid songs for 20 years and I never got a bath, I'd probably be a bit irritable at night too.
The phone guy says the animatronics have been around for 20 years. Chuck E. Cheese was founded in 1977. 20 years later would be 1997, which is towards the end of the glory days of Charles Entertainment Cheese. Number 3, the paycheck. Mike Schmidt takes home $120 for his 30-hour work week. Matt Pat uses minimum wage to try to narrow down the reasonable dates because Fazbear Entertainment is absolutely a company that pays its employees minimum wage. In 1997, the federal minimum wage was at $5.15. 30 hours a week would net you $154.50 per paycheck. That's a little high. But Social Security and Medicare come out of your paycheck before you receive it. Taking out that much, you'd be left with $142.68. Still too high. But at this point in this franchise, we have no idea when Fazbear is founded. It doesn't have to be the same year as Chuck E. Cheese. And Phone Guy could be rounding when he says 20 years anyway. The real sweet spot for the federal minimum wage is 1991 to 1995, when the minimum wage was at $4.25, which nets you $127.50 with no deductions, or $117.75 after deductions, with honorary mention to 1990 when the numbers were just a little bit lower. Pause. This was the first FNAF game. Scott had no idea at this point how crazy popular this game was going to be, or that the fan community would become obsessed with trying to uncover every mystery and overanalyze every bit of subtext. It's hard to know how much thought went into each decision of this game. Making a video game is a form of art, and even if Scott didn't know he was going to assume the role of storyteller and puzzle master for 15 other games, he certainly put attention and care into this game. I mean, if I was making a game, I'd absolutely try and make a realistic paycheck by looking up minimum wage for the year I had in mind, because I'm a numbers person, and including that detail would be satisfying for me. But I don't know if that's the case for Scott as an artist. I think there are 3 possibilities for how Scott approached coming up with this number. The first is what I just said. He looked up minimum wage for the year or range of years he had in mind. The second is he just sort of eyeballed it and picked a number that felt reasonable. The third is he worked a minimum wage job himself around this time period and thought something like, I remember my first job flipping burgers at Whataburger. I was so excited to take home my first paycheck. I think it was around $120. Let's zoom in on that third option because we are being as thorough as possible in this video. Scott was born in June 1978. In the US, some places will let you work as young as 14. It's likely Scott worked some minimum wage job between 14 and 19, though his Wikipedia article says nothing about past jobs. Scott was 14 to 19 in 1990 to 1997, which is around the years we're looking at. Now, the reason why minimum wage increased in 1996 and made the numbers too big to fit the paycheck in FNAF 1 was because of something called the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was made in 1938. It established the federal minimum wage and other things like time and a half pay and not employing minors and oppressive child labor. In 1996, some big amendments were made that increased the minimum wage over the next 2 years so that it would hit $5.15 by 1997. However, it also instituted something called youth minimum wage, which said that an employer could pay its employees under the age of 20 $4.25 an hour for the first 90 days of their employment, and then after that they have to pay them the federal standard. If Scott did pick the paycheck number, fondly remembering his first paychecks at his minimum wage job, this actually expands our reasonable dates to include 1996, 97, and 98, because Scott would have been 19 until June of 1998. I should also point out that Scott is from Texas. Minimum wage at a job always must be the larger between federal, state, and municipal minimum wage, and Texas is not above the federal minimum wage for any of these dates, so we don't need to look at a Texas-specific calculation. Is it more likely that Scott looked up a minimum wage number or just picked a number based off his real-life experience?
The world may never know.
FNAF 2. Following shortly after the wild success of FNAF 1, FNAF 2 has 3 new pieces of information we can use to help determine the date of its predecessor, and they all occur on this paycheck. Once again, we get paid at the end of night 5, having worked a 30-hour work week. Jeremy Fitzgerald made $100.50 on November 12th, 1987. Oh, there's more to glean from this paycheck than you're expecting. Let's do the 2 obvious first. Firstly, FNAF 2 is a prequel. We find out that the animatronics are allowed to walk around freely during the day at this location. In FNAF 1, Phone Guy said the animatronics used to walk around until the bite of 87 happens. So the bite hasn't happened yet in FNAF 2, but it will before FNAF 1. This paycheck is dated 1987, which means FNAF 1 takes place after 1987. Our minimum wage sweet spot was later than that already, but it's a nice nod in the right direction. Second, having the full date November 12th, 1987 means Fazbear pays out the weekly paycheck on Thursday. Once again, we need to ask, is Scott the kind of artist who would take into account that companies are usually consistent between locations and years about what days of the week they issue paychecks on? If so, we can narrow down our dates very considerably because the FNAF 1 paycheck is also dated for November 12th. Our prospective years would then be narrowed down to 1992 and 1998. Thirdly, and I haven't heard this mentioned before and I'm very excited about it, the FNAF 2 paycheck is exactly $100.50. Why the 50 cents? It's because this is the exact minimum wage calculation for 30 hours in 1987 with no deductions. $3.35 an hour for 30 hours, $100.50. This definitely tells me something about Scott and his relationship with the paycheck calculations. He cared enough to look up the minimum wage, but not enough to consider paycheck deductions. What does this mean for FNAF 1? Well, in FNAF 1, we got paid exactly $120 for 30 hours of work. At no year does the federal minimum wage work out exactly to $120. It's just close at $127.50 from 1991 to 1995. Mike actually made $4 an hour instead of $4.25. Now, like I said before, minimum wage is always the highest between federal and state, which means it's possible Scott looked up a specific state's minimum wage. If so, it would have to be a specific state before 1991, otherwise it would be superseded by the higher federal rate of $4.25. Spreadsheet time! The minimum wage by state was not $4 in any state in these years. In fact, I don't think it was $4 in any state in any year, because everyone made a jump from $3.30 something to $4.25 in 1991. This leads me to believe that Scott likely either picked a number that felt reasonable to him for the FNAF 1 paycheck or tried to remember one of his own paychecks from around the same time. Which means we should probably be decently generous with our paycheck math. If we really think FNAF 1 takes place in like 2020 but the paychecks don't line up, we might just have to shrug and accept the headcanon that Fazbear was illegally underpaying their employees. On to FNAF 3. Yeah, okay, we'll get back to you, buddy. How about FNAF 4 and sister location? One important piece of information we put together between these two games is who the player of FNAF 1 was. Mike Schmidt is really Mike Afton, the son of the purple guy, the Foxy Bro. Does knowing the recipient of the FNAF 1 paycheck change anything for us? Well, it could. Like I said before, the Fair Labor Standards Act amendments of 1996 instituted a youth pay for people under 20. Do we think Scott took into account the age of the security guard in FNAF 1 and the Fair Labor Standards Act when he didn't even calculate Social Security withholdings for the FNAF 2 paycheck? No. Will I take it into account while making this video? Absolutely. I love spreadsheets, and I promise this would be the most comprehensive guide you'll ever need for when FNAF 1 takes place. Besides, let's be real, some things in the early FNAF games were not planned and don't make a ton of sense, and we as the community have a field day trying to figure them out and make them make sense anyway. So even if Scott didn't intend it, we can still have fun figuring out if Fazbear was illegally paying Mike under the federal minimum wage. Now, our range of years of interest for FNAF 1 are 1987 all the way through 2014 when the game came out. How old would Mike be during those years? We see Mike in 1983 in the FNAF 4 Between Night minigames. In these minigames, there are short kids and tall kids. Mike is among the tall kids. I take this to mean Mike has hit his middle school growth spurt, which normally hits between ages 12 and 15 for boys. We can add a year earlier for comfort in case he grew early. How many years should we add to the other end? How old would a kid realistically be running around wearing a Foxy mask and jump scaring his kid brother? Even adding 1 year and making it 16 feels pretty old for that, but Mike does come from an extremely dysfunctional household, and that can mess with hitting developmental and maturity benchmarks, so I'll say Mike could be between ages 11 and 17 in 1983. That said, I find it most likely that Mike is 12 or 13. Mike is then born between 1966 to 1972, with 1970 being the most likely year. At the absolute youngest, Mike is born in 1972 and hits 20 years old in 1992, which means he would never have been eligible for youth pay because it didn't even start until 1996. We actually don't have that much evidence in subsequent games, but we do eventually get the Faz tokens that tell us that Fazbear was founded in 1983. This could recontextualize Phone Guy's lines,
For 20 years, and I never got a bath.
20 years after 1983 is 2003, which is much later than we've looked at so far. Minimum wage from 1997 to 2006 is $5.15, which puts the paycheck at $154.50. That's just a little high, but we just said we have to have leeway to fudge the paycheck number. Rytoast has been theorizing that Fall Fest was the birthplace of many of the beloved Fazbear characters. If this is the case, the earliest date we have for Fall Fest is 1970, so if it's confirmed in Secret of the Mimic that some of the characters are older than Fazbear's, Phone Guy's line could make sense with the date as early as 1990. We also find out through the novel trilogy and the lawsuit in Pizzeria Simulator that FNAF takes place in Utah, so we've got a bunch of new minimum wage numbers to check. Oh wait, no we don't, because they're all under the federal minimum, at least up until 2014 when FNAF 1 came out. Oh my goodness, is it time for my absolute favorite FNAF book to take center stage? Oh hey, what are you doing here, Security Logbook? The Security Logbook in my mind is tied to the week before for the most lore-dense book. This baby is packed. It's fun, and I've been obsessing over one of the pages for many of the days now. Let's get into it. This book belongs to Mike. That's Mike Schmidt-Afton, the protagonist of all the mainline games of the first arc except probably FNAF World and Ultimate Custom Night. This is a book produced by the Fazbear Frights company that ran the horror attraction of FNAF 3. How do I know? Without going too in-depth, it's because this book doesn't break character of being in universe, except the copyright page of course. There are ghosts having a lovely chit-chat in the book, so that sure seems in universe. It references Springlock suits, which we know were retired by the company before the MCI in 1985, so the book could take place before 1985, except Chica has a MacBook knockoff and there's an image of her dabbing, which was a 2015 trend. So if it's far after Springlock suits, yet knows about them, then it's published by the company that found the vintage audio training cassettes about Springlock suits, Fazbear Frights, the horror experience company. Throughout the book, Mike writes in red pen and makes little doodles. He's a pretty good artist, to be honest. If he wasn't a horrifying shell of a man all consumed by his purpose to stop his father and save those with soul, he probably could have made it as an artist. I mean, he's even got the trauma for it. Anyways, the book has these vintage coupons that are $1 amount off some Fazbear package, like $8 off the Perfect Pizza Pack, or $4 off Chica's Cupcake Chaos. Each section is labeled something fun that's also a pun on how dangerous Freddy's is, like take a bite, out of fun on your next birthday, or slice up some family fun at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And they range from $4 to $8, except for the last bunch of coupons, which are for much more, $12 to $16. The reason why can be deduced from the title, Grand Reopening. Join us at the new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. All the other coupons were for the original MCI location, which we will later learn featured the same classic animatronic designs as the FNAF 1 location, but the last bunch of coupons is specifically for the FNAF 1 reopening of that location. The prices are higher not just to adjust for inflation, but also to entice entice people to come back, despite the now prevalent rumors about the company. The final coupon is for $16, and Mike has written in red pen, "For real value, see page 61. Flipping to page 61, we find comic panels that were meant to finish. Foxy and Freddy talking while Foxy reads a newspaper labeled Friday, and then a wider shot where we see that they're in a classroom and the numbers 5 plus 4 and also 3 are written on the board. These being the only numbers on the page, it seems that this 5 plus 4 and 3 are somehow meant to lead us to the real value of the $16 coupon. I promise I'm not going to reference GiBi in every video I make, but I'm also not going to take credit for something I didn't think of by myself. GiBi very correctly says that the only action that makes sense here is to add 5 plus 4 and multiply it by 3 to get 27 and plug it into the official inflation calculator. $16 in FNAF 1 is worth $27 now, and we can use the inflation calculation to figure out what year FNAF 1 took place. So we plug 16 in and start guessing dates against the date now. But when is the date now? It's finally time to talk about FNAF 3, I suppose. The description of FNAF 3 says, 30 years after Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed its doors, the events that took place there have become nothing more than a rumor and a childhood memory. But the owners of Fazbear Frights, the horror attraction, are determined to revive the legend. Now there's two interpretations of what it means for Freddy Fazbear's Pizza to close its doors. Number one, it's talking about when the last Freddy's location, the FNAF 1 location, closed. If this is the case, it's of absolutely no use to us with the inflation calculator because both dates are then unknown and there's many dates for which $16 would convert into $27. This interpretation has another problem because we know from Pizzeria Simulator, Fazbear's became a franchise, meaning entrepreneurs paid for the right to open a location under the Fazbear name and start up a restaurant, and at least one was opened by Mike. And Pizzeria Simulator absolutely takes place after FNAF 3. So FNAF 3 cannot take place 30 years after Fazbear closes its doors, because then it would have to take place after Pizzeria Simulator, and it takes place before Pizzeria Simulator. I'm making it clear in this section, I don't believe FNAF 3 took place in the future at the time of release. But if you believe that, I'm not calling that theory stupid. This is FNAF and all things are unknowable. No theory is stupid. I am just wholly convinced by GiBi that it's option number 2. It's referring to the close of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the MCI location, that closed in 1985 after the MCI, making FNAF 3 take place in 2015, the year that the game came out. So then, we want to plug $27 in 2015 into the calculator and find what year it would have been worth $16. It's never that simple with FNAF, because the real value in this book could be referencing the real value in 2015, the year FNAF 3 takes place and when this book would have been published in universe, or it could be referencing when this book was actually published in the real world in 2017. So we'll try it against both dates and see what happens. But wait, inflation rates are constantly changing, and we also have the option to plug in months as well as just the year. Luckily, my full-time job is working with spreadsheets and I'm obsessed with FNAF, and so I spreadsheeted out this inflation conversion for many plausible dates. The plausible dates for FNAF 1 are any year from 1987 through 2003, but I actually stopped at 1998 because the numbers got so far from $27 it wasn't even worth doing anymore. And for each year FNAF 1 could take place, I checked 2 months, January and November. November because that's the month FNAF 1 actually takes place, and January because if you're just doing a conversion year to year and not paying attention to months, it's standard to go January to January. Now for the dates for FNAF 3 or the security logbook. January 2015, the year of FNAF 3. March of 2015, the month the game actually came out. August and December of 2015, because we don't know what month FNAF 3 takes place in, and I wanted to cover my bases in case the date is one day revealed. January 2017, the year of the security logbook. October, November of 2017, the month the security logbook would have been in writing, editing, quality assurance. December 2017, the month the security logbook came out. Now, if you're wondering why I don't at least include 2023 to be fair to the people who believe in that theory, it's because you can't really predict inflation, which means Scott could not have put out this book that was published in 2017, a calculation for inflation 5 years in the future. Behold my spreadsheet, so pretty and color coordinated. As you see, dates where $16 is worth about $27 for any combination of the dates in question range from 1990 to 1994. Conveniently, those years also fit with the minimum wage range. There are a few extra numbers that are $26 and ever so many cents that round up to $27, but no new years are included by representing those numbers. Now, which of these numbers are most likely to be the intended solution? Two numbers stand out to me because of how close they are to $27 exactly. The first is the date GiBi proposes, 1992. This number is obtained taking January 1992 against January 2015, aka the proposed year of FNAF 1 against the year of FNAF 3. The second likely date is 1993. This is from November 1993 against anywhere from October to December of 2017, aka the year and month of FNAF 1 against the months of writing and publishing the security logbook. If you're watching the screen here and not listening to this video like a podcast, you might notice that I I didn't highlight one date that actually gives us $27 perfectly, January of 1994 with October-November of 2017. And that's because I find it really unlikely Scott used a specific month of the security logbook, but not the specific month of FNAF 1. If this was October-November of the security logbook with November 1994, I'd be sold, but October-November with January is just weird. All that to say, 1992 and 1993 are my most likely candidates based on security logbook evidence, but 1990 to 1994 are still reasonable. Oh? You thought we were done with this page? In this, the most in-depth guide to when FNAF 1 takes place that you'll ever need? I think not. There's one other detail on this page. Foxy is reading a newspaper that says, Friday. Call me a conspiracy theorist who's up too late writing this script, but you cannot convince me that's just a meaningless inclusion. I think Scott is trying to tell us that Friday is important to figuring out these dates as well. And, well, we have a specific date that we get paid in FNAF 1, November the 12th. We can check to see if it's a Friday. We get paid on November 12th. November 12th, 1992 was a Thursday, which makes November 12th, 1993 a Friday. Case closed, except not entirely, because a fun fact people love to mention when they're in favor of the year 1992 is that it's a wink from Scott to place his game in a year that has a Friday the 13th. So this Friday on the newspaper could be taken to confirm two theories. One, that you get paid at Fazbear Inc. on Friday and November 12th has to be a Friday, or that Scott set this horror game in a week that has a Friday the 13th. After all, in FNAF 2, your overtime check comes on November 13th, 1987, Friday the 13th. If FNAF 1 is in 1992, your overtime paycheck would also be on Friday the 13th. So while this doesn't help distinguish between our two favorite dates, I believe it does help us rule out 1990, 91, and 94. What's that? Could it possibly be? Is it really time for my favorite FNAF book the week before to solve all FNAF lore for all time for us? That's right, the new FNAF interactive novel, aka Choose Your Own Adventure, but they can't say that or they'll get copyrighted, book, is here to solve everything. It's time to bid farewell to GiBi as the mastermind behind this piece of evidence, and say hello to Unwithered Truth, who's made an incredible theory about when FNAF 1 takes place based on evidence in the week before. There are a lot of pop culture references in the week before, and right off the bat, I am deferring to Unwithered Truth's research about them, because pop culture references are so lost on me, and genuinely many references sail over my head. I didn't have access to the internet or watch media more recent than the 70s for the bulk of my developmental years. No, I was not raised Amish. I said I was done talking about GiBi, but they pointed out recently the weakness of a lot of theorists are not being able to identify when FNAF is referencing other media or tropes, and it's a big reason why I have to be so diligent about listening to other theorists, because I was raised under a rock. And media references are not like a 3D render in the game where you can see that and be like, huh, I don't know what that is, let me go on the game theory Reddit and see if anyone's talked about it. When you miss a pop culture reference, more often than not, you don't even know it, you just read over it. Maybe think, huh, that sentence was worded weird, and you don't even know to look it up. Every theorist has their weaknesses and blind spots. Full transparency, that's one of mine, and I'm so grateful that FNAF has an enormous community of passionate theorists who I can lean on to overcome my blind spots. We make progress towards the story when we collaborate and rely on each other. So if I'm ever missing a pop culture reference, tell me about it in the comments so I can add it to my list to watch, read, or listen to. All that said, Unwithered Truth says, of all references to real-world media and technology we have in the week before, the Sega Genesis gaming console that came out in August of 1989 is the most recent. And I scrolled all the way down in the comments to see if anyone contradicted that evidence and found nothing. They also point out that we get a reference to multiple Lethal Weapon movies, another 1989 date, strengthening that FNAF 1 takes place 1989 or after. This evidence goes against 1987 and 1988 dates, though 1987 was never likely at all since it'd have to have opened a month after FNAF 2 closed. We learned from the week before that the FNAF 1 location is only recently reopened. The phone guy, Ralph, and others throughout the book have a lot to say about the FNAF 2 location. Wendy is a 911 operator who Ralph can call in one of the game over endings. She references a tragic 911 call from Freddy's. Freddy's? I thought they closed up after that horror. She draws a shaky breath. I didn't take those calls, thankfully, but I heard the recordings, and, well, it wasn't pretty. Wendy could be referring to either the original missing children's incident in 1985 or the Bite of 87 and surrounding incidents. 1987 is more likely because the MCI calls would likely sound something like, "Please, can you send an officer down? I can't find my child, and they were last seen at the party room at Freddy's." Whereas the Bite of 87 call would more likely sound like, "Someone's been bitten, their brain is exposed, send paramedics, oh, the humanity." And of those two calls, I would characterize one as worrying and eventually saddening, whereas the other I would describe as, "I didn't take those calls, thankfully, but I heard the recordings, and well, it wasn't pretty." All that to say, Wendy remembers the FNAF 2 location, but the FNAF 1 location has been opened so recently that a 911 operator hasn't heard of it yet, which is impressive because I can imagine Freddy gets 911 called on them a lot. And again, Ralph's boss references that a reporter is visiting to see how the location is doing since they reopened. These pieces of information make the dates closer to the 2000s much less likely. Would Freddy's have been closed for almost 15 years and people still be talking like this? Also, if Freddy's was closed for even 5 years, what has Ralph been doing? He's been employed with the company for what he describes as ages. He's taken no new jobs between FNAF 2 and FNAF 1. If there's no open locations between then, was he just sitting at home for years waiting for Freddy's to call him up again? Pretty unlikely. Being in middle management, he was probably kept on between locations to help dismantle the FNAF 2 paraphernalia and reassemble it in this new comeback location. And that process might take more than a year, but certainly not more than 3 or 4. However, one piece of evidence from this book might make us rethink that. Ralph dials the voicemail code into the phone on night 1 and listens to an old recording of himself. The book then says this: "You hang up. You know the rest. It's strange to listen to a recording of yourself, especially one from so long ago. If you remember correctly, your daughter had just been born, a big reason why you couldn't take the night shift yourself at the time." We know from elsewhere in the book that Coppelia is 11, turning 12 in December. If Fazbear was founded in 1983, then that's the earliest date Ralph could have started. If Coppelia was born in December of 1983, that would put FNAF 1 all the way in 1995. But perhaps she was born in December of 82, then she would still only be a few months old when Ralph could have recorded these. And we could probably even push it back 1 year. If she's born in December of 1981 and Fazbear is founded in January of 1983, she would have just barely hit a year old if Ralph started day 1 with the company. At just barely a year, it's reasonable for Ralph to call that around the time she was born. I certainly wouldn't be comfortable working the night shift as a single parent with a 1-year-old daughter at home. However, the more likely interpretation is that Coppelia is born in 1982 and was a few months old in 1983. The range of acceptable dates that leaves us with then is 1993 or 1994 at the earliest. Meaning, there was a 6 or more year gap when Ralph was employed by the company despite no new locations opening. But once again, Unwithered Truth makes an appearance to argue that maybe we shouldn't pay attention to these dates at all for a few very good reasons. First of all, even though this page was in the official published book, you actually can't reach this page by playing the game. The week before is a choose-your-own-adventure style game where you pick an action out of a list of options and are led to a new bit of story where you make another decision. Some decisions you can make are locked behind items. So in the past, you had to pick an option that would lead you to collecting the item, and then you can progress with certain options only if you picked up that item. The option you have to select to get this page requires you to have a voicemail code to punch in on night 1. Only trouble is you can't get that item until night 4. There's another instance of this happening where you have an option that requires an item you can't get, but that page is a troll page and calls you out for cheating using an item you don't have. This page says nothing of the sort. Instead, Ralph listens to the voicemail, makes not only 1 but 2 incorrect statements, and then continues on his journey. The first incorrect statement on this page is the one that every theorist has pointed out by now. Ralph says he never brought Coppelia to Freddy's even on Bring Your Child to Work Day. Later in the book, Ralph says Coppelia threw up when he brought her to work when she was 7. The second incorrect statement comes when Ralph remarks that the system sent an old recording, so this must be a glitch. He says this because this recording is really similar to the FNAF 1 Night 1 phone call, but is slightly different. This line is meant to explain to the viewer why the phone call is different than the one you actually get on Night 1. The phone is glitched. We got an older version. Except we know why we don't get that version of the call in FNAF 1. It's a pretty major plot point that Ralph records those messages this week, and he hasn't recorded them yet because it's Night 1. So why is Ralph calling the current message an old message? Candi, I hear you saying, it's possible it's still an older recording and that there have been multiple iterations. Maybe this is an old recording. Yeah, it is, but 5 pages before this page, Ralph says they've been using his same recordings for ages. And he said he doesn't use the phone much at all. He just records the messages and then management sets them up to ring automatically. If Ralph recorded and hasn't listened to them for ages, I just have a hard time believing he would hear one of his old recordings and even realize if it was an older version. I really think this line was meant to explain why the line is different from the FNAF 1 line. Because as Unwithered Truth says, this page is from an earlier iteration of the book, from before they decided how old Coppelia was and before they realized Phone Guy needed to record his messages over the course of the book, and it wasn't properly removed. Unwithered Truth also points out there's basically a better version of this page elsewhere in the book, where Ralph hears one of his old recordings and makes the same sort of remark he makes on this page about how he wished he could give advice to his younger self. Further evidence that this page just wasn't meant to be here. You might be wondering how likely it is the whole page of the book could remain in an error. Pretty likely. There's sort of a similar mistake elsewhere in the book, where the book assumes you have picked up a coin to beat Knight 2, and you can choose whether or not to give it to Coppelia, except you definitely didn't pick up that coin, because you can't pick it up and beat Knight 2. How can this be the case? Well, a choose-your-own-adventure style book is pretty difficult to quality assure. You don't just read it front to back like a normal book to make sure it reads coherently. You have to make a pretty complex flowchart of all the options the player can take and read it that way. It's a little surprising, actually, that the coin mistake made it through, because a playtest through the final copy would show that you can't get the coin. However, it's not surprising at all that a page would be left in an error. If you're going through to make sure the book makes logical sense by reading through the book as intended instead of page by page, you'd never get to that page to see that it's an error, and you're not likely to remember there was one option you never clicked on. This book approaches 300 pages with over 50 endings and 2 difficulty settings. Having said all that, I just gotta point out how strange it is that on the error page, Ralph says this: "You've never brought Coppelia here, not even on Bring Your Child to Work Day. Especially not then." It really makes me wonder if this was meant to hint that the death of Charlie, or even that some of the MCI victims were employees' children. But if I really think this page is from an older version, I've gotta toss out that ominous little hint along with the other evidence. And I really do think this page is an error. There's another statement in the book many have pointed to as being an inconsistency, but Unwithered Truth uses it as the crux of their theory. Coppelia knows the name Fredbear. "You look like that Fredbear thing from your job." "You mean Freddy Fazbear?" "Whatever, he weirds me out. They all do." People consider this line to be an error because of the passage we just talked about. She would just be too young to remember that suit when it was retired and buried away from the public eye in 1985 in time for the missing children's incident. But it's the crux of Unwithered Truth's theory. They claim that doing away with the error page about when Coppelia is born, we can combine her knowing Fredbear's name with the fact that she was brought to Freddy's when she was 7 to infer that her 7th birthday took place right before the suits were retired, meaning her 7th birthday was December 1984 and her upcoming 12th birthday will be December 1989, the year FNAF 1 takes place. It's an incredible theory, and while I absolutely agree that the page about when she was born is not a trustworthy lore source, in this, the most in-depth guide to when FNAF 1 takes place you'll ever need, as always, we need to consider some alternative explanations, because we just don't know for certain that it was Coppelia's 7th birthday bash that caused the name Fredbear to be burned into her mind. Let's look at the page in question. She's never gotten over the time you brought her to work to meet the animatronics when she was 7, and they made her cry so hard she threw up her pizza and cake. She had nightmares for at least a week afterwards. Ralph took her to work to meet the animatronics when she was 7, meaning this was indeed her first trip to the restaurant, and she had nightmares and cried and threw up because of them. We know from the week before that Ralph is a great dad. FNAF once upon a time only had horrible father figures, and it made us worried for Scott and wonder what male mentor made him make all the fictional fathers like the worst, most neglectful and abusive characters in all of FNAF. But no more. We've got Ralph and Cassie's dad and Oswald's dad, and they're all fantastic. And honestly, of the 3, Ralph is winning Father of the Year award. He's just really caring and a thoughtful father to Coppelia. It's really sweet. Makes his death really sad. So it's extremely unlikely that Ralph ever brought Coppelia back to this place she has such a horrible memory of and hates so much. So Unwithered Truth's theory is looking really solid. For her to know Fredbear her 7th birthday is kind of her only opportunity, if Fredbear was only an animatronic. But Fredbear was also a popular cartoon character and merch line, which does pose a problem as Coppelia, like her father and unlike me, is full of references to media around her time. And Ralph, ever the Fazbear enthusiast, absolutely would have been putting Fredbear and Friends on for her to watch as a little kid. And Ralph was around with the company during the days of the old Springlock suits. He recorded the training tapes about how to use them safely. Well, as safe as you can. And Ralph likely would have mentioned the name Fredbear to his daughter back in the old days when he was still a character in the rotation. All that in mind, what date ranges are reasonable for Coppelia to remember the name of Fredbear from the cartoon or from frequent mentioning around the house? Well, you tend to start remembering most of your memories from age 4 and on. If the Fredbear character is retired in time for the MCI in June of 1985, Coppelia was born at earliest December 1980, meaning the fact that she knows Fredbear could point to a date anytime between 1989 and 1992. 1993 if you think she would remember the name of Fredbear at 3 years and 6 months old. So once again, we're just dancing around the same dates we've been toying with since 2014. Oh, but baby, we are not done with the week before. Let's look at some more hints. How about this page where Ralph reminisces about Fredbear's family diner? The green color has faded, along with the words stamped on it, Fredbear's Family Diner. Now that's a throwback. That place has been closed for years, but it was a predecessor to Fazbear Entertainment's Freddy's Pizza franchise. This artifact might just be worth more than the gold ring if you found the right buyer. Freddy's biggest fans will buy anything. Fredbear's Family Diner is a throwback, you say? That place was open in 1983. Calling something a throwback usually means it's a reference to a different era. Often we use it to mean a throwback to a different decade. Like I might say My Chemical Romance is a throwback to the 2000s, or Bell Bottoms are a throwback to the 70s. However, people do use throwback when something reminds them of a different era of their life personally. Even people who are only a few years out of college might say something is a throwback to their college years. So I don't think the word itself has a ton of insight for us, because I think it could mean anything from 5 years to multiple decades in this context. But the fact that a Fredbear's Family Diner artifact in weathered condition is a vintage Fazbear artifact that could be worth more than a gold ring? That does sound like we're creeping up on a decade or more of Fredbear's being closed. How about another instance of a very subjective word? Ralph says the animatronics have been restored to their classic look for this new location, but he says it in a very specific way. You're glad they restored the vintage animatronic with his classic look. Vintage. Of all the dates I'm still seriously playing around with FNAF 1 taking place in, being 1989 to 1993, vintage is a strong word for an animatronic designed in 1983 when Fazbear was founded. While this line could be pointing us towards some later dates, or be an error or an exaggeration, what I'm really hoping is that it's hinting that we're going to get some serious closure on one particularly frustrating piece of evidence sometime soon.
If I were forced to sing those same stupid songs for 20 years,
This line is so out of place compared to all of our other evidence. It really seemed like Scott threw this line away and disowned it. It's the only line that points to FNAF 1 being in the late 90s or early 2000s. And yet, with this one line, they restored the vintage animatronic with his classic look. Scott seems to have reclaimed that old line. Vintage? 10 years is not vintage, but 20 years? Yeah, that's starting to creep up on vintage. So am I about to say that the early 2000s dates are back in the running? Actually, no. There's just so much evidence to the contrary. But I think this shows us that some of the Freddy's characters, including Freddy Fazbear, may predate Fazbear Incorporated, just like Rytos suggested with his theory about Fall Fest. And finally, even though we haven't seen when the characters themselves were created, I feel I can put the line to rest about the animatronics being 20 years old and trust that by the time FNAF 28 releases, Scott or Steelwool or Megacat or whoever's running things by then will have an answer for us. Are we done with evidence from the week before? Haha, in this, the most in-depth guide to when FNAF 1 takes place that you'll ever need? Absolutely not. But let's move away from vague wording and towards some more concrete evidence. Back on the old, is Fazbear, or more realistically Scott, consistent about what days the employees get paid? We actually know what days of the week each night of the week before it takes place on because Coppelia goes to school for 4 days and then skips school on Friday. Meaning, night 1, Ralph is rolling up to the building 11:55 p.m. Sunday night and clocking in just as the clock rolls over to midnight of Monday morning. If we are to assume he is working the same work week as all night guards at that location do, then Mike Schmidafton also has his night 1 on Sunday night, technically Monday morning. If Mike gets his paycheck at the end of his 5th shift, he's getting paid on Friday afternoon and working his overtime on Saturday. And that is firmly in favor of 1993 because November 12th, 1993 is a Friday. However, it is not guaranteed that Ralph and Mike are working the same days of the week because we don't see Ralph get his paycheck. He does put in for overtime on night 6, but overtime has nothing to do with what day of the week you work and everything to do with how many hours you work in a pay period. It is still possible for Mike to take his first shift on Saturday night, Sunday morning, and get paid on Thursday. In fact, it would make a lot of sense since Phone Guy's last night is night 6, Friday night, Saturday morning, and the shift is conveniently open for Mike the next day. Groovy. As ever, we dance around 92 and 93. And now for my secret weapon piece of evidence I've been holding on to until the very, very end. Let's talk about Bronwyn's phone. If you're going for the true ending of the game, then Ralph must collect Bronwyn's mobile phone on night 6, and we even get a picture of it. Let's research some old phones, shall we? The original mobile phones were analog. Nowadays we use digital phones. What is analog versus digital? I don't know. Many websites attempted to explain it to me with minimal success. As far as I can understand, and hopefully we'll get some commenters that can make this more clear, an analog phone sends messages using radio frequencies and operates on a continuum, whereas digital signals come through in binary. Each type of signal has advantages and disadvantages, and we decided digital is better for cell phones. But I really don't understand because I'm pretty sure digital phones use radio waves as well. They just use them differently somehow. Whatever the case, digital won out over analog because it's quicker and cheaper and more useful for the way we use phones. The very first commercially available mobile phone was an analog phone produced in 1983, the Motorola Dynatac 8000X. Cool name. You could use it for 30 whole minutes on a single charge. This phone is way too chunky and boxy and big to be Bronwyn's phone from the photo. Not to mention it cost $4,000 and very few people owned one. This phone is also not considered very portable because it couldn't hold much of a charge and it was was frankly a beast. Cellular phones were installed as car phones for those very reasons. Up until the 1989 Motorola Microtac 9800X. While the name doesn't sound quite as cool as the Dynatac, this phone was sick. I mean, look at that 9-inch sleek design, perfectly suited to fit in your shirt pocket. Not to mention tripling the battery life to accommodate 90 minutes of talk time. Also, apparently the antenna on the phone was entirely for show, and the actual antenna was internal. Unwithered truth, if you're watching this video, I want you to know that I saw you use the Microtac as your visual when you talked about Bronwyn's phone, the only reasonable model of phone that would have been available with your proposed date of 1989. The attention to detail is just incredible. So much thought went into not only your theory, but also your visuals and audios, with absolutely no guarantee that anyone would ever know you researched phone models to be accurate. Really impressive. This phone could fit the bill for Bronwyn's phone, except for a few problems. Number one, the design of the phone image we're giving does not feature this iconic flip-up piece for protecting the numpad, and the screen is significantly smaller than the image. Number two, the standby time. This refers to how long the battery on a phone lasts if you don't use it at all before you have to charge it. And I had a devil of a time trying to find the standby time on this model, but I believe the standby time on the original Microtac was 30 hours. Even if we give or take some hours to account for errors because my source didn't cite its sources, this phone just couldn't stay awake long enough for Ralph to make phone calls over the course of 5 nights. Ralph doesn't have a mobile phone himself, which means he couldn't have been charging it at home. Number 3, the price. The Microtac retailed for $3,000. Now, it's possible Bronwyn worked for a news agency that had that kind of money, or she had wealthy tech enthusiast parents, but very unlikely. This phone was expensive. There are several more iterations of the Microtac. The Microtac Lite in 91, the Microtac Classic also in 91, the Ultra Lite in 92, the first phone ever to have a vibration ringer, then the Elite in 94, and the 650 in 96. If Scott or E.C. Myers researched the history of mobile phones for writing this, and it's very possible they did not, and instead went off of their personal memory of what phones were around at the time because they were born in 1978 and would remember. It is improbable they looked up any of these phones because they only come up once you start going down the Google rabbit hole of the original Microtac itself. That said, I'll give special mention to the Microtac 650 in 1996 for fitting the design of Bronwyn's phone most closely. Please welcome the 1992 Motorola International 3200, another chunky beast. This was the first digital mobile phone, which still doesn't mean very much to me because I didn't understand analog in the first place. Wikipedia says this phone resembles an elongated brick, and they are right. This phone unfortunately has all the same issues as the Microtac, being extremely unsimilar to the image we have, retailing at I think around $1,050, which is admittedly more reasonable, and with only 8 hours of standby. But as far as I can tell, this phone was sold in the UK, so there's no reason Bronwyn should own it, and there's no reason Coffin or Myers would remember it. Let's move on. The Nokia 1011 was called the 1011 because it was released on the 10th of November 1992. This phone and its successors, the 2010 and the 2110, are the earliest designs I can find that start to fit the design of Bronwyn's phone. However, we are still far from the battery life we need, with the 2011's battery lasting only 12 hours on standby. The 1993 IBM Simon is frankly so visually distinct there's no way that this could be what they had in mind. Pretty cool though. At this point in my research, I realized I should probably stop going phone by phone and look at our 3 problems: design, battery life, and cost, and start to see when we hit those benchmarks. Easiest first, design. In 1992, the 1011 was already decently close. We're looking for phones that are rectangular with rounded corners, decently thin, large screen, an antenna, and minimal buttons besides the numpad. The 1994 Nokia 2110 that I mentioned before fits pretty well, or maybe the 96 Nortel Nevada, but that was a UK phone, which led me down the rabbit hole of why a phone in Europe would be named after Nevada. Turns out Nevada comes from the Spanish word nieve, meaning snow, and the state of Nevada is named for the mountain range the Sierra Nevadas, and about 700 of my viewers are from Nevada. Ain't that neat? From 1994 on, we have plenty of models that fit the bill, but how about battery life? I used to write academic papers all the time, and I swear it was not this hard to find a source that cited its sources. I started digging pretty deep, looking for reliable information on some of these old phone models before I realized there's no way Scott and E.C. Myers were turning to Google Scholar to figure out how much standby time Bronwyn's phone had. So I am letting it go, and am sourcing my information from engagingwithcommunications.com. The first phone they list to hit the benchmark of lasting 5 days on standby without a charge is the 1996 Nokia 8110, which could apparently go for 6 days. How about affordability? Now, there are lots of sources out there that can tell me phone prices took a dip following the Microtac and went from $3,000 to just under $1,000, where they've been sitting pretty steadily ever since, with a few dips. The BlackBerry Pearl went for about $350 in 2006. $1,000 is a lot for a junior news reporter. The Motorola M300 in 1993 was designed to be for the masses, including a much lower cost around $400, but this was another UK phone. However, you don't usually buy a phone for full cost. You sign up for 2 years of Verizon and trade in your old model and they knock $450 off. When did people start doing that? If I thought battery life was hard to find info on, this really took the cake. I heard 90s, I heard late 90s. I got one completely unverifiable source that said T-Mobile started it, and I didn't even get a year. Sources were so hard to find, I called my grandpa. He didn't know, but apparently they bought my mom a bag phone when she went to college. Super groovy. The conclusion. The practice of offering a phone discount when you sign up with a carrier was established at an unknown time in the 90s, and phones in the US got cheaper around 93. Putting all these factors together, the earliest model Bronwyn's phone could be in terms of our latest limiting factor, battery life, isn't available until 1996. The earliest model you could afford without being the bourgeoisie? Maybe 93 when the IBM Simon dipped below the $1,000 mark. The earliest design model that could fit the reference image is December 1992, and the earliest model that's not the size of a concrete slab, 1989. Now, we've gone through each piece of evidence we could find. Let's do a flyby of every detail we've examined through this whole video, and more than that, let's think critically about how much weight we should put on each clue we've been given. We'll put ourselves in the shoes of Scott Cawthon and ask how much forethought he was putting into each of the details we're looking at. Back to FNAF 1. FNAF 1 takes place after FNAF 2. FNAF 2 happens November 1987. This piece of evidence is clean and irrevocable. Scott clearly made this decision intentionally, and we have no contradicting evidence to suggest FNAF 1 takes place before 1987. FNAF 1 is a Chuck E. Cheese analog, and the heyday of Chuck E. Cheese was in the late 80s to the 90s. This, loose evidence. Nothing is stopping Scott from putting his fictional Chuck E. Cheese equivalent in a different decade.
If I were forced to sing those same stupid songs for 20 years and I never got a bath,
this line is really unclear. Unlike being a Chuck E. Cheese analog, I'd call this hard evidence, but it has two big flaws. The first is that it points to a date around 2003, which is the latest date we've ever pointed to by a margin of 5 or 6 years. And the second is just how early in the franchise it's said. Information from the earlier FNAF games, but especially FNAF 1, needs to be interpreted in light of the fact that there wasn't planning for a franchise. At some point, Scott realized he had a franchise on his hands, and realized that he wasn't just a storyteller, but also a puzzle maker. He definitely didn't realize as early as FNAF 1. For how little story points we got in FNAF 1, even fewer of them are ever followed up on as the story continues. Because this evidence comes so early and is not supported as we go along, this is weak evidence to me. Up next is the paycheck. As we know, Scott seemed to have Googled minimum wage in 1987 for FNAF 2, but no minimum wage calculations anywhere in the US for any year follow the same pattern for the FNAF 1 paycheck. As such, I have to conclude that Scott went off of either vibes or his own memory for the time period he had in mind, and was likely thinking of year 1997 or earlier, when he and his peers could have been making around that much in the real world. But we have it in our power to do the calculation and see that 1987 to 1990, a pay rate of $4 an hour before deductions is legal, and 1987 to 1995, a pay rate of $4 an hour after deductions is legal. Evidence going forward seems to support dates from the late 80s to mid-90s, and as such, it seems Scott honored his original number for the paycheck. Dates before 1995 are well supported by this evidence. Finally, the evidence that the day of the week Fazbear pays its employees is Thursday. This evidence comes from FNAF 2, which is still pretty early for Scott to have come into his own as the puzzle master. This is also not the reason why Scott put the year on the paycheck. He wasn't trying to tell us what day of the week we get paid, he's trying to tell us Jeremy is about to get his frontal lobe bit off. As such, I have to count this as weak evidence. Our evidence from FNAF 4 and Sister Location told us Mike Schmidafton is the player and roughly how old he is in 1987. This did not affect our understanding of minimum wage and therefore is irrelevant evidence. The security logbook has our next clues, where we tick over from weak evidence we're not really sure Scott thought out to very strong evidence. Because if any piece of FNAF media represents Scott's switch from storyteller to puzzle master, it's the book that's full of puzzles that took us years to solve. The inflation calculation for $27 in either 2015 or 2017 down to $16 in the past gives us a range of dates from 1990 to 94, with 92 matching up perfectly with the 2015 date and 93 matching up perfectly with the 2017 date. If you think FNAF 3 takes place in 2023, 30 years after the date MatPat proposed for FNAF 1, then the 1992-2015 combo is out and we've solved the date. If you think FNAF 3 takes place in 2015, 30 years after the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the year FNAF 3 came out, then both 92 and 93 remain on the table. 1992 and 93 are extremely strong evidence points in my book, especially when combined with the Friday newspaper that's likely referencing either Friday the 13th of 1992 or Friday, November November 12th, 1993. The week before referencing pop culture up to 89 is strong evidence that FNAF 1 does not take place before that point. The suspicious page about Coppelia being born when Ralph started working for Fazbear is weak evidence to me, but I can understand if it's strong evidence to some. The fact that the page seems to have been left in error is enough to condemn it for me, but if that detail is true, FNAF 1 must take place at earliest 1993, but far more likely 1994 and on. Coppelia knows the name of Fredbear, which could have put her 7th birthday right before the MCI and put FNAF 1 in 1989. Or she could remember from watching the Fredbear and Friends cartoon as a younger kid. This puts FNAF 1 1992 and before comfortably, and we can loop in 1993 with some skepticism about if Coppelia would remember a show she watched when she was only 3.5. Is this weak evidence or strong evidence? I'm not sure, to be honest. It's hard to tell if this was supposed to be a big intentional clue or just dialogue without too much thought behind it. You can let me know what you think it is in the comments. The vibe of everyone's attitude about Fredbear's Family Diner, the bite of 87, how long Ralph has been working with Fazbear all seem to me to be strong evidence, meaning they were decisions for the book that were made intentionally with full knowledge, but they're not specific enough to give us a date. Fredbear's is a throwback, its memorabilia is for collectors, the bite of 87 is fresh in everyone's memory, Ralph has been working for Freddy's for ages, for way too long, for many years. There doesn't seem to be too long a gap between the restaurant's closing in 1987 and this restaurant opening now. All these non-specific statements give me the feel that the FNAF 1 location was open around like 1989 to 1991. While I think the wordings are all intentional decisions, trying to pin them down to a specific year is not possible. I've tried citing "that's just the vibe" in an academic paper, and let me tell you, it did not fly. The actual days of the week before takes place on, are to me irrelevant information because we don't actually see which of those days Ralph gets his paycheck, or learn what day Mike starts his first shift. And finally, the phone. The phone has a few elements to discuss separately. The inclusion of the mobile phone must put FNAF 1 after 1983. At the bare minimum, Cawthon or Myers must have Googled when was the first mobile phone. This is very strong, but also irrelevant because we know FNAF 1 takes place after 1983. The battery life of mobile phones is less strong evidence. I know from my own research how difficult it is to find some of this information from a credible source, which leads me to believe that, like the FNAF 1 paycheck, the phone was likely the result of Cawthon or Myers' own memory of mobile phones in the late 80s or 90s. I find it very unlikely they thought of how long the battery would last on standby, and if they did, they likely concluded they didn't need to bother with accuracy there because this is an alternate universe where the fun times existed in the 80s. They probably had some better battery technology in this universe. The design of the phone I at first thought would be strong evidence, until I considered the process by which this piece of art would have come to be in this book. It probably looked like Scott or someone at Scholastic hitting up an artist whose name I cannot find anywhere, and gave them the book, where they needed the images, and maybe a vague description like Bonnie's head on the ground or old mobile phone. Leaving the only phone evidence I think to be actually strong is when could a normal person afford a phone that fit in their pocket? To which the answer is the early 90s and on. So what date do I think it is? 1992. But the absolute number one takeaway from this video is that if you see somebody putting out a date that is after November 1987 and before 2014, you may not say that they are obviously wrong because nothing about when FNAF 1 takes place is quote obvious. Did I miss anything, or did I fail to place proper importance on a piece of evidence you think is the key to it all? I read all my comments, so you're welcome to let me know. That's all for this one, cadets. Gosh, I love that. I'm Candi and these are my cadets. I have been Candy Bunny, and I have candy all day. Candy, candy, candy.